discuss it about these BatchApex. So BatchApex is an asynchronous process. If you would like to process a large number of records, then we can go with these BatchApex option. So generally we are having an governor limits. So these governor limits is basically if you would like to process up to 50,000 records, you can go with our synchronous process. But in the case of if you would like to process more than 50,000 records, then we don't have any option in our synchronous. Why? Because we are having an corner limits. So if you would like to process more than 50k records, then we can go with these corresponding batch apex as well as schedule apex. We are having some asynchronous operations, so we can opt for these asynchronous operations. So if I'm using like these batch apex, we can process up to 50 million records. We can process up to 50 million records with the help of our BatchApex. So these BatchApex is basically we are going to use to process more number of records, and it is an asynchronous process. So asynchronous process in sense the response we are not getting immediately whenever system resources are available, whenever Salesforce server is available, at the time it is going to execute it. For example, if you create the record or like if you're like modifying the record, our triggers will execute immediately, and whatever the code, whatever the logic you have implemented, so that is going to reflect in our record immediately. But in the case of these batch epics, it won't execute immediately, and it will take some time. It will take some time, and in order to execute these batch epics, we will we will go with our database.batchable interface. So with the help of a database.batchable interface, we are able to database.batchable interface. With the help of this one, we can execute our batch apex. So within these batch apex, what we can do, we can process up to 50 million records, and these batch apex contains three methods. So one is a start method and execute method. Then after we are having like a finish method. So BatchApex contain three methods: start method, execute method, and finish method. So one key thing we need to remember here it is if you are using BatchApex, it is executing in asynchronous mode. So the response you won't get immediately, and it will execute it. It will execute it after like some time whenever system resources are available. Whenever system resources are available, so at the time only it is going to execute it. Okay, so these batch apex it is executing based on data based on batchable interface. Data based on batchable interface. So these batch apex contain three methods: start method, execute method, and then finish method. So here the start method return type. The start method return type is basically data based on query locator, and data like we are having one more so our database dot iterable. Okay, so these two interfaces are available. So these two interfaces are available based on our requirement. Based on our requirement, we are going to use any one of these return type. Okay, so in the case of like a execute method, we are having like a return type is void, and in the case of like a finish method, the return type is void here. So in the case of like a start method, the return type is database.query locator or database.iterable. And in the case of like a finish method and the execute method, the return type is void. That means null. So depending upon your requirement, you are going to use either database.query locator or database.iterable. So if you are using database.query locator, you can process up to 50 million records. You can process up to 50 million records. In the case of these database.iterable, you can process up to 50K records. Okay, so with these database start iterable, we are able to implement a custom scope, and in the case of these database start query locator, we are able to process up to 50 million records. 50 million records. So these things we need to remember. So in our interviews also, sometimes they are going to ask you these question. So they are going to ask you this question. So the question is basically, what is the written type of these start method, written type of execute method, written type of finish method. At the time, simply what we can say, so we are going to use a database dot query locator, database dot iterable. So these two we can specify. And then in the case of execute method and finish method, the written type is void. So if I'm using database query locator, we can process up to 50 million records. In the case of database iterable, we can process up to 50K records. So these all things we need to remember. And generally they are going to ask you one more question. So what are the interfaces you have worked on? Or what are the interfaces you have used? So in these BatchApex, we are going to use database.batchable. So stateful, database.stateful, and we are going to use uh, like, uh, allow callouts, allow callouts. So so these are the interfaces generally we are using in our um, BatchApex. Okay, so depending upon our requirement, we are going to use these second two interfaces. But if you would like to implement a BatchApex, by default you need to use these database.batchable interface. These database.batchable interface. So now the thing here it is in the case of if I'm using these BatchApex, what I'm going to do, I'm going to implement a start method, execute method, and then finish method. So these three methods are mandatory if you are implementing these BatchApex. And now the basic skeleton of these BatchApex is basically what we are going to do. So simply we can use public or global. So your class and then class name implements database dot batchable batchable s object. So s object like this we are going to implement it, and then so here what we are going to do, so public or global database dot query locator or database dot iterable iterable, and then I'm going to use a start method here. So within the start method, I need to specify database dot batchable s object, batchable context BC. I'm going to implement this one. So here we are just querying the records. So here we are just querying the records. Whatever the records do you want to process, you can simply query the records here. Okay, so whatever the object you are going to query, simply query here. And in our execute method, public void execute. And here what we are going to do, we are going to specify database data batchable context BC, or database data batchable context scope, or whatever the object you are going to use, simply we can specify here. Okay, for example, if I am using a list of a subject, whatever the object you have queried, simply you can specify here. Okay, sorry. And our actual business logic we are implementing here. Actual business logic, business logic we are implementing here. Okay, so then after we are going to use public void and then finish method. So within the finish method also, we are going to use this database dot batchable context bc, and then we can write it here. So if you are using any of these batch apex, we need to follow the same structure. We need to follow the same structure. So here, generally, majority of the people they are going to use global only, but you can use either public or global for these batch epics. And here you can you need to use these three methods. That's a mandatory. Without these three methods, you cannot implement your batch epics. And it is a mandatory to import these data based at batchable S object interface. So without this one, you cannot get the your batch fix properties here. Okay, and as I mentioned in our start method, we are going to just query the records. We are not implementing any logic. We are going to simply query the records here. And in the case of our execute method, we are going to we are going to simply execute the records here. Okay, whatever the records you have queried in your start method, so those records you are going to process in your business logic in this um, in this execute method. So the thing here it is the thing here it is in the case of this execute method, so it is going to execute multiple times depending upon number of records. And this finish method it is going to execute after all the business logic execution is completed, then only this finish method will be executed. So in our interview, you will get this question as well. How many times start method will be executed? How many times execute method will execute? How many times finish method will be executed? So we need to remember these key points as well. So when I am using this batch apex start method, it is going to execute only once. It is going to execute only once, and finish method also it is going to execute only once. Only this execute method it is going to execute based on your number of records. Based on number of records. So for example, I have queried around 1,000 records, and your batch size is basically 100. So then your execute method will execute, so 1,000 by 100, so it is going to execute 10 times here. So it is going to execute 10 times. In the case of your number of records like 1,000, and your batch size is 200. So your batch size is 200. So then it is going to execute 1,000 by 200. So then 5 times it is going to execute it. So depending upon number of number of records, and your batch size based on that your execute method will be executed. So in the case of your start method returns zero records. Your start method returns zero records. So then it is going to execute zero times. It is going to execute zero times. So in the case of your start method, it won't return any records. Then your execute method it won't execute. Only start method and then finish method it is going to execute. Sometimes what happen, right? We are trying to fetch the data with the help of our start method. But the thing here it is sometimes sometimes based on the filters what we are going to apply here, so it won't return any records. So if it is not returning any records, then by default finish method will be executed, but execute method it won't execute it. Okay, so if the records is available, then only these execute method will execute. Okay, and the next thing here it is as I mentioned, depending upon number of records and batch size, so these execute method will be executed. So in our interview generally they are going to ask us this question. So how many times start method will be executed, how many times execute method will execute, how many times finish method will be executed. Okay, so as I mentioned, start method and then finish method it is going to execute only once, and execute method, it is going to execute based on number of records, based on number of records and your batch size. So in the case of if they are asking question like this, so in the case of your start method returning 0 records, so then how many times execute method will execute? So as I mentioned, if your start method will return 0 records, then it won't execute. This execute method, it won't execute. It directly move to the finish method, and finish method will execute it. So even though it is returning records or not, by default these start method and then finish method will be executed. But in the case of like if records is available, then your execute method will execute. Your execute method will execute. Okay. So whatever the business logic you need to implement about these batch apex, you need to write it within this execute method. And in the case of like in the case of these uh, these batch size and the number of records, based on that this execute method will be executed. So you we already discussed about like these batch size. So the minimum batch size here it is the minimum batch size what we can give. So minimum batch size, what we can do, we can go with 1, and maximum batch size, maximum batch size we can opt for 2000. Okay. So the default batch size, so we are going to use 200. So if you're not specifying anything, by default, it is going to like consider as 200. So you can give minimum batch size as 1 and maximum batch size as 2000. So in the case of like a default batch size, we can go with 200. So like this, we can specify here. So in our interview, they are going to ask you about like these batches as well. What is default batch size, and what is the minimum batch size? What is the maximum batch size? So default batch size in sense, if you are not providing any batch size, if you are not providing any batch size, so by default it is going to consider as a 200. So if you are able to provide your batch size like 100, 50, 20, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. So whatever the number you are going to specify, based on that your batch size will be considered. But if you are not providing any batch size, then by default it is going to consider as 200. So maximum we can go with up to 2000. We cannot like go beyond that. In the case of like a minimum, we can go up to like a 1. So we cannot go like a beyond that. Okay. So these are the batch limits available in our batch apex. So they are going to like ask you one more question here. So can we call one batch from another batch? So it is like a general interview questions. Can we call one batch from another batch? Okay, so here we are having like one thumb rule. One asynchronous processor we cannot invoke from another asynchronous process. So that means if you're like trying to call the future method from the batch apex, or if you're like trying to call the like a batch apex from the future method, it won't allow. Why? Because so it is those are like a asynchronous process. So those two are like a asynchronous process. So because of that, we cannot like invoke one batch from the future method to the batch, or batch to the future method. So in the case of like they are going to ask you this question. So can we call a future method from can we call like a batch apex from another batch apex? So here we are having one workaround. We can call one batch apex from another batch apex, but we need to call only in our finish method. We need to call only in our finish method, so that once your first batch is completed, then only second batch execution will start. Then only second batch execution will be start, so that it will execute in a sequence mode. It is going to execute in a sequence mode. So because of this because of this one moment. Team, are able to hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
So because of like this sequence, we are going to call in our finish method. So in the case of if you're trying to call a batch apex in either start method or execute method, it will throw an error. It will throw an error. So that's why always we need to call it only from our finish method. Okay, so how we are going to execute our batch? So it is also one of the interview question. So how we are going to call our batch apex? So if we are creating a your class as your batch class name is something like a sample batch like this, sample batch like this. So then we need to create the instance for our batch class. We need to create the instance for our batch class. I'm creating an instance is sb new sample batch. Whatever the a class we are having, I'm going to create this batch here. So then after what I'm going to do, sp dot if you would like to execute this one, system dot execute execute. I need to provide the these sp, and then I'm going to give the batches here. So if you're not providing any batch, then sorry, database dot execute, database dot execute, then we are going to provide the these instance name. We need to provide the these instance name. So in the case of, if you are if you would like to provide the batch size, then you can simply give whatever the batch size you want. For example, if I would like to give as a 10, or I would like to give as 20, or I would like to give as a 30, so like this you can give your batches. So as I mentioned, these batches is basically from 1 to 2000, you can give any number. Okay, from 1 to 2000 you can give any number. So for example, if you are not providing any batch size, then by default it is going to consider as a 200. So depending upon your requirement, so whatever the batch size do you want to provide, whatever the batch size do you want to provide, you can simply provide here. You can simply provide here. So it is our batch apex execution. And as I mentioned, if you would like to call, if you would like to call one batch from another batch, then we can call it only from the finish method. So these point we need to remember. So if you would like to call one batch from another batch, then we can call it only from our finish method. Okay, so the thing here it is how we are going to call in sense, whatever the second batch available here, I'm going to specify here. So whatever the class name we are having, so the class name dot database dot execute, one moment,